And how are you this fine Wednesday afternoon? Well, it's Wednesday here in New Zealand anyway. So here we go. Just opening up the book. We are reading, once again, so you know, we're reading Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. And you can probably get it at the library if mum or dad or grandma or grandpa or auntie or uncle or any of those other people, as described in Millie Molly Mandy, don't have a copy themselves. Then you can probably get it at the library, or you can get it for free from Project Gutenberg online. And if you're not an adult, you can ask an adult to help you to do that. So we were reading chapter 5 is where we finished last time, which was Monday for my time, and it was Alice had been in this rather odd little shop, and I'm just going to read the last little bit of it before we go into the next chapter. She went off to the other end of the shop, that's the shopkeeper, and set the egg upright on a shelf. That's the sheep, the shopkeeper. I wonder why it wouldn't do, thought Alice as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. The egg seems to be getting further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? Why, it's got branches. I declare, how very odd to find trees growing here. And actually, here's a little brook. Well, this is the very queerest shop I ever saw. So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she quite expected the egg to do the same. And that was chapter 5, and we're about to start chapter 6. Have you got your drink of water, remember? I'm going to have mine between chapters. Have a drink of water. We're about to start chapter 6, which is called Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and larger and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and mouth. And when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. Can't be anybody else, she said to herself. I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take any notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure after all, like a soft toy. And how exactly like an egg he is, she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. It's very provoking, Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, to be called an egg. Very. I said you looked like an egg, sir, Alice gently explained, and some eggs are very pretty, you know, she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment. Some people, said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, have no more sense than a baby. Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he'd never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree, so she stood and softly repeated to herself, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty in his place again. That last line is much too long for the poetry, she added, almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time, but tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but... It's a stupid enough name, Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is too. With a name like yours you might be any shape almost. Why do you sit out here all alone? Said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. Why, because there's nobody with me, cried Humpty Dumpty. Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another one. Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground? Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. That wall is so very narrow. What tremendously easy riddles you ask, Humpty Dumpty growled out. Of course I don't think so. Why, if ever I did fall off, which there is no chance of, but if I did, here he pursed his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me, with his very own mouth, to send all his horses and all his men, Alice interrupted, rather unwisely. Now I declare that's too bad, Humpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys, or you wouldn't have known it. I haven't indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Ah, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty said in a calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now take a look at me. I'm one that has spoken to a king. I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another, and to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leant forwards, and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought, and then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. Sorry, I had lunch. It was slightly spicy, so I'm sniffing and coughing. Yes, all his horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a minute, they would. However, this conversation's going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one. I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said very politely. In that case, we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty. And it's my turn to choose the subject. He talks about it just as if it was a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation and said 7 years and 6 months. Wrong, Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it. I thought you meant how old are you? Just somebody downstairs making a smoothie. So that's all. I thought you meant how old are you, Alice explained. If I'd meant that, I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said leave off at 7, but it's too late now. I never ask advice about growing, Alice said indignantly. Too proud? The other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at this suggestion. I mean, she said, that one can't help growing older. One can't, perhaps, said Humpty Dumpty, but 2 can. With proper assistance, you might have left off at 7. What a beautiful belt you've got on, Alice suddenly remarked. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were going to take turns in choosing a subject, it was her turn now. At least, she corrected herself on second thoughts. A beautiful cravat, I should have said. No, a belt, I beg your pardon, she added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. If I only knew, she thought to herself, which was neck and which was waist. Evidently Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. It is a most provoking thing, he said at last, when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt. I know it's very ignorant of me, Alice said in so humble a tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now. Is it really? Said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. They gave it to me, Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. They gave it to me for an unbirthday present. I beg your pardon, Alice said with a puzzled air. I'm not offended, said Humpty Dumpty. I mean, what is an unbirthday present? A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course. Alice considered a little. I like birthday presents best, she said at last. You don't know what you're talking about, cried Humpty Dumpty. How many days are there in a year? 365, said Alice. And how many birthdays have you? 1. And if you take 1 from 365, what remains? 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see that done on paper, he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and wrote the sum for him. 6, I'm writing it for you. 5, whichever way it goes. And then underneath, 1, and then a line underneath. And then 3, 6, 4. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. That seems to be done right, he began. You're holding it upside down now, Alice interrupted. To be sure I was, Humpty said gaily as she turned it round for him. I thought it looked a little queer. As I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get an unbirthday present. Certainly, said Alice, and only 1 for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I mean, there's a nice knock-down argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knock-down argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean. Neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. Alice was too much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrably, that's what I say. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, what that means? Now you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very pleased. I meant by impenetrably that we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life. That's a great deal to make one word mean, Alice said in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work like that, said Humpty Dumpty, I always pay it extra. Oh, said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. Ah, you should see him come round me on a Saturday night, Humpty Dumpty went on, wagging his head gravely from side to side. For to get their wages, you know. Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so, you see, I can't tell you. You seem very clever at explaining words, sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky? Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all the poems that were ever invented and a good many that haven't been invented yet. This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogoves, and the moan wraths outgrabe. That's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. That'll do very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are 2 meanings packed into one word. I see it now, Alice remarked thoughtfully. And what are toves? Well, toves are something like badgers. They're something like lizards. And they're something like corkscrews. They must be very curious-looking creatures. They are that, said Humpty Dumpty. Also they make their nests under sundials. Also they live on cheese. And what's the gyre and to gimble? To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope. To gimble is to make holes like a gimlet. And the wabe, Is the grass plot round a sundial, I suppose, said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Of course it is. It's called wabe, you know, because it goes a long way before it and a long way behind it. And a long way beyond it on either side, Alice added. Exactly so. Well then, mimsy is flimsy and miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. And a borogrove is a thin, shabby-looking bird with its feathers sticking out all round, something like a live mop. And then mome-raths, said Alice. I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble. Well, a rath is a sort of green pig, but mome I'm not certain about. I think it's short for from home, meaning that they'd lost their way, you know. And what does outgrabe mean? Well, outgrabing is something between bellowing and whistling, with a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it done, maybe, down in the wood yonder, and when you've once heard it, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all that hard stuff to you? I read it in a book, said Alice, but I had some poetry repeated to me, much easier than that, by Tweedledee, I think it was. As to poetry, you know, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands, I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, for if it comes to that. Oh, it needn't come to that, Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. The piece I'm going to repeat, he went on, without noticing her remark, was written entirely for your amusement. Alice felt that in that case she really ought to listen to it. So she sat down and said, thank you, rather sadly. I don't think she wants to listen to any more poems. Probably making her head spin. In winter when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it, he said as an explanation. I see you don't, said Alice. If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've sharper eyes than most, Humpty Dumpty remarked severely. Alice was silent. In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean. Thank you very much, said Alice. In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down. I will if I can remember it so long, said Alice. You needn't go on making remarks like that, Humpty Dumpty said. They're not sensible and they put me out. I sent a message to the fish. I told them this is what I wish. The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fish's answer was, we cannot do it, sir, because... I'm afraid I don't quite understand, said Alice. It gets easier further on, Humpty Dumpty replied. I sent to them again to say it will be better to obey. The fishes answered with a grin, why, what a temper you are in. I told them once, I told them twice, they would not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump. I filled the kettle at the pump. Then someone came to me and said, the little fishes are in bed. I said to him, I said it plain, then you must wake them up again. I said it very loud and clear, I went and shouted in his ear. Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream as he repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, I wouldn't have been the messenger for anything. But he was very stiff and proud. He said, you needn't shout so loud. And he was very proud and stiff. He said, I'd go and wake them if... I took a corkscrew from the shelf, and I went to wake them up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but... There was a long pause. Is that all? Alice timidly asked. That's all, said Humpty Dumpty. Goodbye. This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to stay. So she got up and held out her hand. Goodbye till we meet again, she said as cheerfully as she could. I shouldn't know you again if we did meet, Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. You're so exactly like other people. The face is what one goes by generally, Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. That's just what I complain of, said Humpty Dumpty. Your face is the same as everybody has. The two eyes so, marking their places in the air with his thumb. Nose in the middle, mouth under, it's always the same. Now, if you had the two eyes on the same side of the nose, for instance, or the mouth at the top, that would be some help. It wouldn't look nice, Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, "Wait till you've tried." Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said goodbye once more, and getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away, but she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, "Of all the unsatisfactory—" She repeated this aloud as if it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say. "Of all the unsatisfactory people I have ever met—" She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. And that's the end of chapter 6, so it's time for a drink of water and deal with all your itches and wiggles and wriggles and everything else you need to do. Stay hydrated. It also helps with your reading and your thinking. It helps you to think more clearly if you have enough water in you. Chapter 7, The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment, soldiers came running through the forest, at first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds that they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree for fear of being run over, and watched them go by. She thought that in all her life she had never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, these managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very grateful to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. "I've sent them all," the king cried in a tone of delight on seeing Alice. "Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood?" "Yes, I did," said Alice. "Several thousand, I should think." 4,207, that's the exact number, the king said, referring to his book. "I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are waiting and wanted in the game, and I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They're both gone to the town. Just look along the road and tell me if you can see either of them." "I see nobody on the road," said Alice. "I only wish I had such eyes," the king remarked in a fretful tone, "to be able to see nobody, and at that distance too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into," for the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the king. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes." Attitudes was an old word for poses or stances, the way you stood or sat, and people used to practice them. I don't know why. No idea. "He only does them when he's happy. His name is Haiha." No, he pronounced it so as to rhyme with mare. Hair. Haigha, pronounced hair. "I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he is happy. I hate him with an H because he is hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Hare, and he lives on the hill," the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. That's an old word game. "The other messengers called Hatter. I must have 2, you know, to come and go, 1 to come and 1 to go." "I beg your pardon," said Alice. It isn't respectable to beg," said the king. "I only meant that I don't understand," said Alice. "Why 1 to come and 1 to go?" "Didn't I tell you?" the king repeated impatiently. "I must have 2 to fetch and carry, 1 to fetch and 1 to carry. At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make the most fearful faces at the poor king. "This young lady loves you with an H," the king said, introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself. But it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side. "You alarm me," said the king. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich." On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung around his neck and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily. "Another sandwich," said the king. "There's nothing left but hay now," the messenger said, peeping into the bag. "Hay, then," the king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see that it revived him a good deal. "There's nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her as he munched away. "I should think throwing cold water over you would be better," Alice suggested, "or some sal volatile. I think that's smelling salts." "I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said there was nothing like it," which Alice did not venture to deny. "Who did you pass on the road?" the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too, so of course nobody walks slower than you." "I do my best," the messenger said in a sulky tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do." "He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell us what happened in the town." "I'll whisper it," said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice, "They're at it again!" "Do you call that a whisper?" cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself. "If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered." It went through and through my head like an earthquake. It would have been a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. "Who are at it again?" she ventured to ask. "Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course," said the king. "Fighting for the crown?" "Yes, to be sure," said the king, "and the best of the joke is that it's my crown all the while. Let's run and see them." And they trotted off, Alice repeating to herself as she ran the words of the old song. "The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all round the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown. Some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town." "Does the one that wins get the crown?" she asked, as well as she could, for the running was putting her quite out of breath. "Dear me, no," said the king. "What an idea!" "Would you be good enough," Alice panted out after running a little further, "to stop a minute, just to get one's breath back?" "I'm good enough," the king said, "only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick, you might as well try to stop a bandersnatch." Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence, till they came in sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and the unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hatter, the other messenger, was standing watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. He's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in," Hatter Hare whispered to Alice, "and they only give them oyster shells in there, so you see he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?" he went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hatter's neck. Hatter looked round and nodded and went on with his bread and butter. "Were you happy in prison, dear child?" said Hare. Hatter looked round once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say. "Speak, can't you?" Hare cried impatiently, but Hatter only munched away and drank some more tea. "Speak, won't you?" cried the king. "How are they getting on with the fight?" Hatter made a desperate effort and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter. "They're getting on very well," he said in a choking voice. "Each of them has been down about 87 times. "Then I suppose they'll soon bring the white bread and the brown," Alice ventured to remark. "It's waiting for 'em now," said Hatter. "This is a bit of it as I'm eating." There was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down panting while the king called out, 10 minutes allowed for refreshments. Hare and Hatter set to work at once, carrying rough trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry. I don't think they'll fight any more today, the king said to Hatter. Go and order the drums to begin. And Hatter went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two Alice stood silent, watching him. Suddenly she brightened up. Look, look, she cried, pointing eagerly. There's the White Queen running across the country. She came flying out of the wood over yonder. How fast those queens can run. There's some enemy after her, no doubt, the king said, without even looking round. That wood's full of them. But aren't you going to run and help her? Alice asked, very much surprised at his taking it so quietly. No use, said the king. She runs so fearfully quick you might as well try to catch a Bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her if you like. She's a dear, good creature, he repeated softly to himself as he opened his memorandum book. Do you spell creature with a double E? At this moment the unicorn sauntered by them with his hands in his pockets. I had the best of it this time, he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed. A little, the king replied rather nervously. You shouldn't have run him through with your horn, you know. It didn't hurt him, the unicorn said carelessly, and he was going on when his eye happened to fall upon Alice. He turned round rather instantly and stood for some time looking at her with an air of the deepest disgust. What is this? He said at last. This is a child, Hare said eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her and spreading out both his hands toward her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude. We only found it today. It's as large as life and twice as natural. I always thought they were fabulous monsters, said the unicorn. Is it alive? It can talk, Hare said solemnly. The unicorn looked dreamily at Alice and said, Talk, child. Alice could not help her lips curling up into a smile as she began. Do you know, I always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters too. I never saw one alive before. Well, now that we have seen each other, said the unicorn, if you'll believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain? Yes, if you like, said Alice. Come and fetch out the plum cake. Plum cake, old man, the unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. None of your brown bread for me. Certainly, the king muttered and beckoned to Hare. Open the bag, he whispered. Quick, not that one, that's full of hay. Hare took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold, while he got out a dish and a carving knife. How they all came out of it, Alice couldn't guess. It was just like a conjuring trick, she thought. The lion had joined them while this was going on. He looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut. What's this? He said, blinking lazily at Alice, and speaking in a deep, hollow tone that sounded like the tolling of a great bell. Ah, what is it now? The unicorn cried eagerly. You'll never guess. I couldn't. The lion looked at Alice wearily. Are you animal, vegetable, or mineral? He said, yawning at every other word. It's a fabulous monster, the unicorn cried out before Alice could reply. Then hand round the plum cake, monster, the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on his paws, and sit down, both of you, to the king and the unicorn. Fair play with the cake, you know. The king was evidently very uncomfortable at having to sit down between the two great creatures, but there was no other place for him. What a fight we might have had for the crown now, the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the poor king was nearly shaking off his head, he trembled so much. I should win easily, said the lion. I'm not so sure of that, said the unicorn. Why, I beat you all around the town, you chicken, the lion repeated angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous, and his voice quite quivered. All round the town, he said. That's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge. I'm sure I don't know, the lion growled out as he lay down again. There was too much dust to see anything. What a time the monster is cutting up that cake. Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook with the great dish on her knees and was sawing away diligently with the knife. "It's very provoking," she said in reply to the lion. She was getting quite used to being called the monster. "I've cut several slices already, but they always join on again." "You don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes," the unicorn remarked. "Hand it round first and cut it afterwards." This sounded nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up and carried the dish round, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. "Now cut it up," said the lion as she returned to her place with the empty dish. "I say, this isn't fair," cried the unicorn as Alice sat with the knife in her hand, very much puzzled how to begin. "The monster has given the lion twice as much as me." "She's kept none for herself anyhow," said the lion. "Do you like plum cake, monster?" But before Alice could answer him, the drums began. Where the noise came from she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and it rang through and through her head till she felt quite deafened, and she started to her feet, springing across the little brook in her terror, and had just time to see the lion and unicorn rise to their feet, with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast, before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, vainly trying to shut out the dreadful uproar. "If that doesn't drum them out of town," she thought to herself, "nothing ever will." And that was the end of the chapter, and I'm going to have a look. Yes, we shall read the next one. Chapter 8. It's my own invention. After a while the noise seemed gradually to die away till all was dead silence, and Alice lifted up her head in some alarm. There was no one to be seen, and her first thought was that she must have been dreaming about the lion and the unicorn and those queer Anglo-Saxon messengers. However, there was the great dish still lying at her feet, on which she had tried to cut the plum cake. "So I wasn't dreaming after all," she said to herself, unless we were all part of the same dream. Only I do hope it's my dream and not the Red King's. I don't like belonging to another person's dream," she went on in a rather complaining tone. "I've a great mind to go and wake him and see what happens." At this moment her thoughts were interrupted by a loud shouting of "Ahoy, ahoy, check!" and a knight, dressed in crimson armour, came galloping down upon her, brandishing a great club. Just as he reached her, the horse stopped suddenly. "You're my prisoner!" the knight cried as he tumbled off his horse. Startled as she was, Alice was more frightened for him than for herself at that moment, and watched him with some anxiety as he mounted again. As soon as he was comfortably in the saddle, he began once more, "You're my—" But here another voice broke in, "Ahoy, ahoy, check!" and Alice looked round in some surprise for the new enemy. This time it was a white knight. He drew up at Alice's side and tumbled off his horse, just as the Red Knight had done. Then he got on again, and the 2 knights sat and looked at each other for some time without speaking. Alice looked from one to the other in some bewilderment. "She's my prisoner, you know," the Red Knight said at last. "Yes, but then I came and rescued her," the White Knight replied. "Well, we must fight for her then," said the Red Knight, and he took up his helmet, which hung from the saddle, and was something the shape of a horse's head, and put it on. "You will observe the rules of battle, of course," the White Knight remarked, putting on his helmet too. "I always do," said the Red Knight, and they began banging away at each other with such fury that Alice got behind a tree to be out of the way of the blows. "I wonder now what the rules of battle are," she said to herself as she watched the fight, timidly peeping out from her hiding place. "One rule seems to be that if one knight hits the other, he knocks him off his horse, and if he misses, he tumbles off himself. And another rule seems to be that they hold their clubs with their arms as if they were Punch and Judy. What a noise they make when they tumble, just like a whole set of fire irons falling into the fender. And how quiet the horses are. They let them get on and off them just as if they were tables." Another rule of battle that Alice had not noticed seemed to be that they always fell on their heads, and the battle ended with their both falling off in this way side by side. When they got up again they shook hands, and then the Red Knight mounted and galloped off. "It was a glorious victory, wasn't it?" said the White Knight as he came up, panting. "I don't know," said Alice doubtfully. "I don't want to be anybody's prisoner. I want to be a queen." "So you will when you've crossed the next brook," said the White Knight. "I'll see you safe to the end of the wood, and then I must go back, you know. That's the end of my move." "Thank you very much," said Alice. May I help you off with your helmet?" It was evidently more than he could manage by himself. However, she managed to shake him out of it at last. "Now one can breathe more easily," said the knight, putting back his shaggy hair with both hands, and turning his gentle face and large, mild eyes to Alice. She thought she had never seen such a strange-looking soldier in all her life. He was dressed in tin armour, which seemed to fit him very badly, and he had a queer-shaped little deal box fastened across his shoulder. Deal is a type of wood they used to use, like for games, for game pieces. The lid was fastened across the box was fastened across his shoulder, upside down, and with the lid hanging open. Alice looked at it with great curiosity. "I see you're admiring my little box," the knight said in a friendly tone. "It's my own invention to keep clothes and sandwiches in. You see, I carry it upside down so that the rain can't get in." "But the things can get out," Alice gently remarked. "Do you know the lid's open?" "I didn't know it," the knight said, a shade of vexation passing over his face. "Then all the things must have fallen out, and the box will be no use without them." He unfastened it as he spoke, and was just going to throw it into the bushes when a sudden thought seemed to strike him, and he hung it carefully on a tree. "Can you guess why I did that?" he said to Alice. Alice shook her head. "In hopes some bees may make a nest in it, then I should get the honey." "But you've got a beehive or something like one fastened to the saddle," said Alice. "Yes, it's a very good beehive," the knight said in a discontented tone. "One of the best kind, but not a single bee has come near it, and the other thing is a mouse-trap. I suppose the mice keep the bees out, or the bees keep the mice out. I don't know which." "I was wondering what the mouse-trap was for," Alice said. "It isn't very likely there would be any mice on the horse's back." "Not very likely, perhaps," said the knight, "but if they do come, I don't choose to have them running about. You see," he went on after a pause, it's as well to be provided for everything. That's the reason the horse has all those anklets around his feet." "But what are they for?" Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. "To guard against the bites of sharks," the knight replied. "It's an invention of my own. And now help me on. I'll go with you to the end of the wood." "What's the dish for?" "It was meant for plum cake," said Alice. "We'd better take it with us," the knight said. "It'll come in handy if we find any plum cake. Help me to get it into this bag." This took a very long time to manage, though Alice held the bag open very carefully, because the knight was so very awkward in putting in the dish. The first 2 or 3 times that he tried, he fell in himself instead. "It's rather a tight fit, you see," he said, as they got it in at last. "There are so many candlesticks in the bag." And he hung it to the saddle, which was already loaded with bunches of carrots and fire irons and many other things. "I hope you got your hair well fastened on," he continued as they set off. "Only in the usual way," said Alice, smiling. "That's hardly enough," he said anxiously. "You see, the wind is so very strong here. It's as strong as soup." "Have you invented a plan for keeping the hair from being blown off?" Alice inquired. "Not yet," said the knight, "but I've got a plan for keeping it from falling off." "I should like to hear it very much." "First, you take an upright stick," said the knight. "Then you make your hair creep up it like a fruit tree. Now, the reason hair falls off is because it hangs down. Things never fall upwards, you know. It's a plan of my own invention. You may try it if you like." It didn't sound like a comfortable plan, Alice thought, and for a few minutes she walked on in silence, puzzling over the idea, and every now and then stopping to help the poor knight, who certainly was not a good rider. Whenever the horse stopped, which it did very often, he fell off in front, and whenever it went on again, which it generally did rather suddenly, he fell off behind. Otherwise he kept on pretty well, except that he had a habit of now and then falling off sideways, and as he generally did this on the side on which Alice was walking, she soon found that it was the best plan not to walk quite as close to the horse. "I'm afraid you've not had much practice in riding," she ventured to say as she was helping him up from his 5th tumble. The knight looked very much surprised and a little offended at the remark. "What makes you say that?" he asked as he scrambled back into the saddle, keeping hold of Alice's hair with one hand to save himself from falling over on the other side. "Because people don't fall off quite so often when they've had much practice." "I've had plenty of practice," the knight said very gravely. "Plenty of practice." Alice could think of nothing better to say than, "Indeed," but she said it as heartily as she could. They went on a little way in silence after this, the knight with his eyes shut, muttering to himself, and Alice watching anxiously for the next tumble. "The great art of riding," the knight suddenly began in a loud voice, waving his right arm as he spoke, "is to keep—" Here the sentence ended as suddenly as it had begun, as the knight fell heavily on top of his head, exactly in the path where Alice was walking. She was quite frightened this time, and said in an anxious tone as she picked him up, "I hope no bones are broken." "None to speak of," the knight said, as if he didn't mind breaking 2 or 3 of them. "The great art of riding, as I was saying, is to keep your balance properly, like this, you know." He let go of the bridle and stretched out both his arms to show Alice what he meant, and this time he fell flat on his back, right under the horse's feet. "Plenty of practice," he went on, repeating, all the time that Alice was getting him on his feet again. "Plenty of practice." "It's too ridiculous," cried Alice, losing all her patience this time. "You ought to have a wooden horse on wheels, that you ought." "Does that kind go smoothly?" the knight asked in a tone of great interest, clasping his arms round the horse's neck as he spoke, just in time to save himself from tumbling off again. "Much more smoothly than a live horse," Alice said with a little scream of laughter, in spite of all she could do to prevent it. "I'll get one," the knight said thoughtfully to himself. "1 or 2. Several." There was a short silence after this, and then the knight went on again. "I'm a great hand at inventing things. Now I dare say you noticed that the last time you picked me up I was looking rather thoughtful." "You were a little grave," said Alice. "Well, just then I was inventing a new way of getting over a gate. Would you like to hear it?" "Very much indeed," said Alice politely. "I'll tell you how I came to think of it," said the knight. "You see, I said to myself, the only difficulty is with the feet. The head is high enough already. Now first I put my head on top of the gate, and then I stand on my head. Then the feet are high enough, you see. Then I'm over, you see." "Yes, I suppose you'd be over when that was done," Alice said thoughtfully. "But don't you think it would be rather hard?" "I haven't tried it yet," the knight said gravely, "so I can't tell for certain, but I'm afraid it would be a little hard." He looked so vexed at the idea that Alice changed the subject hastily. "What a curious helmet you've got," she said cheerfully. "Is that your invention too?" The knight looked down proudly at his helmet, which hung from the saddle. "Yes," he said, "but I've invented a better one than that. Like a sugar loaf. When I used to wear it, if I fell off the horse, it always touched the ground indirectly. So I had a very little way to fall, you see. But there was the danger of falling into it, to be sure. That happened to me once, and the worst of it was, before I could get out again, the other white knight came and put it on. He thought it was his own helmet." The knight looked so solemn about it that Alice did not dare to laugh. "I'm afraid you must have hurt him," she said in a trembling voice, being on top of his head. "I had to kick him, of course," the knight said very seriously, "and then he took the helmet off again, but it took hours and hours to get me out. I was as fast as lightning, you know." "But that's a different kind of fastness," Alice objected. The knight shook his head. "It was all kinds of fastness with me, I can assure you," he said. He raised his hands in some excitement as he said this, and instantly rolled out of the saddle and headlong into a deep ditch. Alice ran to the side of the ditch to look for him. She was rather startled by the fall, as for some time he had kept on very well, and she was afraid that he really was hurt this time. However, though she could see nothing but the soles of his feet, she was much relieved to hear that he was talking on in his usual tone. "All kinds of fastness," he repeated, "but it was careless of him to put another man's helmet on, with the man in it, too." "How can you go on talking so quietly, head downwards?" Alice asked as she dragged him out by the feet and laid him in a heap on the bank. The knight looked surprised at the question. What does it matter where my body happens to be, he said. My mind goes on working all the same. In fact, the more head downwards I am, the more I keep inventing new things. Now, the cleverest sort of thing of the sort that I ever did, he went on after a pause, was inventing a new pudding during the meat course. In time to have it cooked for the next course, said Alice. Well, not the next course, the knight said in a slow, thoughtful tone. No, certainly not the next course. Then it would have to be the next day. I suppose you wouldn't have 2 pudding courses in one dinner. Well, not the next day, the knight repeated as before. Not the next day. In fact, he went on, holding his head down and his voice getting lower and lower, I don't believe that pudding ever was cooked. In fact, I don't believe that pudding ever will be cooked, and yet it was a very clever pudding to invent. What did you mean it to be made of? Alice asked, hoping to cheer him up, for the poor knight seemed quite low-spirited about it. It began with blotting paper, the knight answered with a groan. That wouldn't be very nice, I'm afraid. Not very nice alone, he interrupted quite eagerly, but you've no idea what a difference it makes mixing it with other things such as gunpowder and sealing wax. And here I must leave you. They had just come to the end of the wood. Alice could only look puzzled. She was thinking of the pudding. You are sad, the nice knight said in an anxious tone. Let me sing you a song to comfort you. Is it very long? Alice said, for she had heard a good deal of poetry that day. It's long, said the knight, but very, very beautiful. Everybody that hears me sing it, either it brings the tears into their eyes, or else what? Said Alice, for the knight had made a sudden pause. Or else it doesn't, you know. The name of the song is called Haddock's Eyes. Oh, that's the name of the song, is it? Said Alice, trying to feel interested. No, you don't understand, the knight said, looking a little vexed. That's what the name is called. The name really is The Aged Man. Then I ought to have said that's what the song is called, Alice corrected herself. No, you oughtn't. That's quite another thing. The song is called Ways and Means, but that's only what it's called, you know. Well, what is the song then? Said Alice, who by this time was completely bewildered. I was coming to that, the knight said. The song really is A Sitting on a Gate, and the tune's my own invention. So saying, he stopped his horse and let the reins fall on its neck, then slowly beating time with one hand, and with a faint smile lighting up his gentle, foolish face, as if he enjoyed the music of his song, he began. Of all the strange things that Alice saw in her journey through the looking-glass, this was the one that she always remembered most clearly. Years afterwards she could bring the whole scene back again, as if it had been only yesterday, the mild blue eyes and kindly smile of the knight, the setting sun gleaming through his hair and shining on his armour in a blaze of light that quite dazzled her, the horse quietly moving about with the reins hanging loose on his neck, cropping the grass at her feet, and the black shadows of the forest behind. All this she took in like a picture as, with one hand shading her eyes, she leaned against a tree watching the strange pair, and listening in a half-dream to the melancholy music of the song. But the tune isn't his own invention, she said to herself. It's I give thee all I can no more. She stood and listened very attentively, but no tears came to her eyes. I'll tell thee everything I can, there's little to relate. I saw an aged man a-sitting on a gate. Who are you, aged man, I said, and how is it you live? His answer trickled through my head like water through a sieve. He said, I look for butterflies that sleep among the wheat. I make them into mutton pies and sell them in the street. I sell them unto men, he said, who sail on stormy seas, and that's the way I get my bread, a trifle, if you please. But I was thinking of a plan to dye one's whiskers green, and always use so large a fan that they could not be seen. So having no reply to give to what the old man said, I cried, Come, tell me how you live, and thumped him on the head. His accents mild took up the tale. He said, I go my ways, and when I find a mountain rill, I set it in a blaze, and thence they make a stuff they call Rowland's Macassar oil, yet 2.5 halfpenny is all they'll give me for my toil. but I was thinking of a way to feed oneself on batter, and so go on from day to day, getting a little fatter. I shook him well from side to side until his face was blue. Come tell me how you live, I cried, and what it is you do. He said, I hunt for haddock's eyes among the heather bright, and work them into waistcoat buttons in the silent night. And these I do not sell for gold or coin of silvery shine, but for a copper halfpenny, and that will purchase 9. I sometimes dig for buttered rolls, or set limited limed twigs for crabs. I sometimes search the grassy knolls for wheels of handsome cabs. And that's the way, he gave a wink, by which I get my wealth, and very gladly will I drink your honour's noble health. I heard him then, for I had just completed my design to keep the Menai bridge from rust by boiling it in wine. I thanked him much for telling me the way he got his wealth, but chiefly for his wish that he might drink my noble health. And now, if e'er by chance I put my fingers into glue, or madly squeeze a right-hand foot into a left-hand shoe, or if I drop upon my toe a very heavy weight, I weep, for it reminds me so of that old man I used to know, whose look was mild, whose speech was slow, whose hair was whiter than the snow, whose face was very like a crow, with eyes like cinders all aglow, which seemed distracted with his woe, who rocked his body to and fro, and muttered mumblingly and low, and as if his mouth were full of dough, who snorted like a buffalo, that summer evening long ago, a-sitting on a gate. As the knight sang the last words of the ballad, he gathered up the reins and turned his horse's head along the road by which they had come. You've only a few yards to go, he said, down the hill and over that little brook, and then you'll be a queen. But you'll stay and see me off first? He asked, as Alice turned with an eager look in the direction to which he pointed. I shan't be long. You'll wait and wave your handkerchief when I get to that turn in the road. I think it'll encourage me, you see. Of course I'll wait, said Alice, and thank you very much for coming so far. And for the song. I liked it very much. I hope so, the knight said doubtfully, but you didn't cry so much as I thought you would. So they shook hands, and then the knight rode slowly away into the forest. It wouldn't take long to see him off, I expect, Alice said to herself, as she stood watching him. There he goes, right on his head as usual. However, he gets on again pretty easily. That comes of having so many things hung around the horse. So she went on talking to herself as she watched the horse walking leisurely along the road, and the knight tumbling off first on one side and then on the other. After the 4th or 5th tumble, he reached the turn, and then she waved her handkerchief to him, and waited till he was out of sight. I hope it encouraged him, she said, as she turned to run down the hill. And now for the last brook, and to be a queen. How grand it sounds! A very few steps brought her to the edge of the brook. The 8th square at last, she cried, as she bounded across, and threw herself down to rest on a lawn as soft as moss, with little flower beds dotted about it here and there. Oh, how glad I am to get here! And what is this on my head? She exclaimed in a tone of dismay, as she put her hands up to something very heavy and fitted tight all round her head. But how can it have got there without my knowing it? She said to herself, as she lifted it off and set it on her lap to make out what it could possibly be. It was a golden crown. And that is the end of chapter 8 and today's reading. So thank you for coming and listening, and thank you if you've chosen to watch it later on as a VOD, and we'll see you again next time with more of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. See you next time. Bye.